In this video, I will demonstrate how to integrate a mobile-first application with the DataPower gateway. To do so, we'll be using a sample application, a sample mobile-first application that you can find linked in this tutorial. And so the first thing that I'm going to do is import the sample application. So this is a MobileFirst Studio 7.1. Make sure you are always using the latest fix pack. And so I'm going to import the sample application. And let's see what we have in this application. It contains an adapter, a simple adapter, which is a JavaScript HTTP adapter, which doesn't do much, just returns data 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But it is protected with a security test that I called DataPower test. And we'll see what that does. On the authentication config XML, you can see the DataPower test, which has some, simple realms, but the one we're interested in now is this one, WAS LTPA realm. Which is defined later. Here it is, WAS LTPA realm. You need to define the class, which is WebSphere form-based authenticator. This basically tells MobileFirst to use the built-in LTPA feature of WebSphere. You need to specify a login page and an error page, even though in our case those won't really be used. DataPower will be responsible for sending the login form. The login module attached to it is WebSphere login module, which also is provided by WebSphere. Next, we're interested in the LTPA keys and server XML, and so here I'm looking at the workspace of Eclipse, and under MobileFirst server config, servers, worklight, I have the server XML. Of course, this is using the built-in server that comes with the studio. This will change depending on your own server configuration. What I'm looking for is this. Basic registry defines a sets of users, which here are the users for the console. And for this test, we're going to be using the same registry. In your application, you can define instead an LDAP registry. I'm going to add another user called Fred with a password of Smith, which is a user that is defined in my DataPower instance, so I also want it to be here. Note that the password is not really important in this file, the server XML, because DataPower is responsible for checking the password. Next, we also have under resources a file called ltpa.keys. This also depends on your server environment. This is the default one provided by the MobileFirst Studio. The default password for this LTPA key is WebAS, and what we're interested in is to make sure, if you look at the WebSphere LTPA realm, you need to look at the value, which here is worklight realm, and make sure that it's the same in your registry. And this is the case here because we're using the built-in one. So this is my DataPower instance. I'm logging into the default domain. What we want to do is create a new domain to import the pattern into. So I will call it pattern demo and create it. Let's switch over to this domain. By default, the pattern uses SSL to communicate between the device and DataPower. And in order to do this, we need an SSL profile. So in this example, I've generated previously a self-signed CA root certificate. And to configure it in DataPower, I'm going to go to SSL profile, SSL proxy profile, and create a new one, which I will call let's say DPSSL. I need to create a new crypto profile. There's going to be a lot of pop-ups here, by the way. So I'm just going to call everything DPSSL. Identification credentials, DPSSL, and this is the important part. I want to add my crypto key. And so I will upload my previously generated self-signed. Okay, so here's the private key. Continue. And I also want to upload my certificate. Upload certificate. Save it. I'm not using an intermediate. I'm going to keep all the default settings here and save it. Okay. Next, we're going to import the pattern that you've downloaded from the blog post. To do so, you're going to go to Blueprint Console and then in Patterns, and you can see here a button to import a pattern. So we're going to look for this file. There it is, and import it. So if right now what it did is just imported the pattern in the console, but it's not deployed yet. So next you see a deploy button, which will launch a form that asks you a few questions. The service name is whatever name you choose that will appear in your configuration, and you can put some description. The URL, the destination URL is where your MobileFirst server lives. So in my case, I'm running on my local machine, and my local IP is 192.168.1.8. The port I'm using is the default one of the studio, and you're going to want to also put the context, which in our case the project is called DataPower, so the context will be DataPower. The SSL proxy profile here is SSL to communicate with the MFP server. So that's not what we've set up. And in my example, I'm using HTTP, not HTTPS. So if your backend server, if your MobileFirst server is also using SSL, that's where you would configure it. What we're interested in is the HTTPS connection. So from the device to DataPower, here we did set up an SSL profile. So IP address, I'm leaving it to 0 for now. It just means that it will listen to any of the IPs that DataPower can listen to. The port, I'm going to use the default one, which here is 49443. And here the SSL proxy profile DPSSL is the one we've just set up. Now, to authenticate with LTPA, we're going to need to upload the LTPA files that we found earlier that came packaged with MobileFirst Studio. So I'm going to look for this file. So it's in my Eclipse workspace, MobileFirst server config, servers, worklight, resources, security, ltpa.keys, and upload it. The default password, I can mention, is capital W, E, B, capital A, capital S, and it will be written on the blog post, so you can copy it from there. Again, you need to put the same file we've uploaded here with the same password. The LTPA key, of course, will depend on your server configuration. This is just the default one for the studio. And then we can click on deploy pattern. Now the pattern has been deployed, and if you go back to the control panel in the multi-protocol gateway, you can see that the new gateway has been created with the default configuration. Next, let's go back to Eclipse, where we have our application. So when you create a hybrid application, by default, it points to your MobileFirst server. But in our case, we don't want the client application to point to the MobileFirst server. We want it to point to the DataPower instance. So if you right-click on the application and you go to Run As, Build Settings, and Deploy Target, you have this setting here. Build the application to work with a different MobileFirst server. And so here we want to set it to our DataPower instance. So I'm using HTTPS, like we mentioned. Next, I have to type the IP of my DataPower instance. So this is my local DataPower instance 101. And the port is the one we defined when deploying the pattern. The context path is the same context path as before. So it's the name of the project here, DataPower. To test this sample, I'm going to add an iOS and iPhone environment, and let's deploy the adapter and deploy the hybrid application. We can open it in Xcode. So a couple things to note, because we are using a self-signed certificate, which by default will not be supported by the iPhone for two reasons. The first reason, we can work around looking at the info plist. So the info plist has app transport security settings, and what I want to do here, I know that this is a self-signed certificate, so it's not good enough for iOS. I'm going to first of all remove the exception domain. Instead, I'm going to allow arbitrary loads, which is not recommended in production, but in development this is the easiest workaround. So this will ensure that your application is willing to communicate with a server that does not have a valid SSL certificate. The second step is to make an exception on the device itself, or in our case, I'm using the simulator. So I'm going to start the simulator. And what I can do is give it my self-signed certificate and install it on the device. So I'm going to look for my file. I have my self-signed certificate.crt, and I'm going to drag it onto the emulator and install the profile. So this will make an exception for this specific device. So, but before we go on, let's take a look at the what does the application do. So if you look at main.js, DataPower, at least this pattern, will send a form, an HTML form to trigger an authentication. It's exactly the same thing as if you looked at form-based authentication in MobileFirst, which I recommend you do before you continue. The way it works is DataPower will send this HTML form, and we create a challenge handler which will look for a string, JSecurity check, that we know is part of the login form. And if it does contain this string, we return true, which means we are going to handle this challenge. And handling this challenge really means just showing a login form, and when you click on submit, we use submit login form and pass the username and password. The rest of the application is just making a request to the adapter we created before, the protected adapter, and showing the results. So let's give it a try. Has two buttons. Let me make it a bit bigger. So the get data button will send a request to the MFP server, but since we don't have an LTPA token, DataPower will not send it through to the MobileFirst server, and instead send us a login form. So if we click, now the challenge handler noticed the string J security check in the response and displayed form. And I'm using Fred Smith as a test user, and we'll take a look at where this is configured. And clicking on login will do a submit login form to DataPower, and immediately, so we have a handle success on the challenge handler, and now our original request is resent with an LTPA token, and now the request continues through to the MobileFirst server, and we have our data 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now if we make another request, we already have the LTPA cookie, so we'll just get our data directly. There's also a logout button, which is the regular logout button, the logout API, WL client logout. And when this happens, the DataPower instance looks for the logout string or the logout URL, and it in addition to the regular MobileFirst server logout, it also clears the LTPA cookies and any other DataPower related cookies. So now the next time we make a request, we start everything from scratch. I've mentioned that I'm using the default Fred Smith as a test user, and if you take a look in your file management of DataPower, under local, you will see a file called my_AAA.xml. And so this file comes with the pattern that you can download. And you can see it defines a few properties. The first one is username Fred, password Smith. So this is why we were able to log in as Fred Smith. The output credential is the credential that will be used, like the user that will be sent to MobileFirst. So there is no example here. Or here, Eve password creates an output credential of guest. So it's basically mapping the username Eve to the user guest. So those are hard-coded credentials, and for your setup, you may want to configure it to communicate with an LDAP server or some other form of authorization. One more tip you may find useful. As you remember, I had to install my self-signed certificate into the iOS simulator to be able to test this. First of all, on Android, it's not that easy. And for other reasons, for example, if you want to easily debug on Wireshark, for any other reason that you do not want to use SSL during your testing, we can manually add an HTTP listener. So if you go to your gateway, the gateway that was created by the pattern, you can see here under front side settings, the front side protocol, we currently have only one, an HTTPS front side handler, which means we're only listening to HTTPS. We can add one with the plus button, choose HTTP front side handler. We'll give it a name. listening to any IP like we did before. We're going to listen to port 4980. Make sure you select the get method and leave everything else default. Apply, apply, and now our gateway is also listening to HTTP. To test it, let's go back to the application. You can take a look at the worklight plist file, which has protocol HTTPS. Let's change it back to HTTP. The port we defined was 4980, and play. Get data, we still have a form. Fred Smith, and everything should work just the same.